Hello and welcome to the second series of Material Matters with me, Grant Gibson. If you hadn't heard the show before, then the idea is that in each podcast we meet a maker, designer, artist or architect who's intrinsically linked to a particular material or technique, discovering how their craft shaped their lives and careers. Today I'm in the Derbyshire studio of the sculptor and artist Laura Ellen Bacon. Now Laura's reputation is built largely around these extraordinary, almost alien structures that she builds by weaving sticks of willow that often appear to ooze disconcertingly out of their host buildings. She's worked at places like the Holborn Museum in Bath, Barrington Court in Somerset, while The Invisible Store of Happiness, a piece she did in collaboration with furniture maker Sebastian Cox, was a centrepiece of 2015's Clerkenwell Design Week. Meanwhile, in 2017, she was shortlisted for the Woman's Hour Craft Prize, and last year her work, Woven Space, even inspired a new orchestral piece of music. Hi Laura, thanks very much for doing this.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, that's my pleasure. Let's kick off with the music. This is extraordinary. So this is a piece by Helen Grime, I think I'm right in saying. How did that come about?
Yes. Well, that piece of music was commissioned for the Barbican in London, I think, and it was conducted by Sir Simon Rattle and performed by the London Symphony Orchestra. How that came about with me being involved in it, it seems amazing to me. It's what a wonderful thing to have happened. And as far as I know from Helen, the reason that happened was because she'd seen a piece of my work at a place called Hall Place, which is in Bexley in London, just outside London. And I'd made a piece of work there in 2016, which she'd seen. That was called Course. And that then led Helen to my previous work as well. And at that point then she was really inspired by Woven Space. And I'm sure you can imagine how amazing that is she got in touch and said, I hope you don't, I hope this is okay, but I'm going to be quoting you as your work has inspired a piece of music I'm working on. And actually, she got in touch with me shortly after the Woman's Hour Craft Prize, and November, I think, and it was just the best news. It was wonderful, and the music itself was performed at the Barbican. It premiered there in the following April, and I went with my dad, and we sat in a sold-out audience, looking down. Or looking amongst the audience and looking down at the orchestra. And when the strings took off in the music, it's just the most profound experience I've had within my creative career, basically. So I'm really pleased you've mentioned that. Thank you.
That's all right. So Woven Space, for those that don't know, was a piece you did in the Museum of Derby, is that right?
Well, actually, it was made at Chatsworth.
Right, okay.
And it led up to a piece that I then made in at Derby Museum, which was a piece called Into the Weave, which what I was looking at in that piece was trying to make a piece of work that you couldn't see. It was all about the interior, so you wouldn't see the artwork, you were in the artwork. And Woven Space was built before that, and it was built in an enclosure of very old yew trees in Chatsworth. Again, you couldn't really see it until you were suddenly in the thick of it. So it was a piece that you could discover. And it was very light, and it was made in white willow against the darkness of the yew. And people's reactions to that were really varied. Some people said it was like being inside a wave. Some people talked about sort of a sort of cathedral-like space, although in miniature, obviously, because it sort of went up high into the trees. But the point was that it was all around you.
So it's quite interesting because there's that old aphorism that architecture is frozen music. Your work is quite architectural, and it's really interesting that it's inspired this piece.
Yes, yeah, and that it lives on in the music, actually. That, like you say, that it lives on. So that has really given me a really different perspective on these spaces that I am still fascinated with making. I will hopefully forever be interested in making spaces that you can enter. I really love it. So to get that different perspective in such a profound way was amazing. It's just one of the highlights of my recent years. I'm so happy that happened.
Can we shift the conversation a little bit? We're here in the extraordinarily beautiful Derbyshire countryside. I mean, you were brought up here.
Yes.
You obviously now live here. You went to the University of Derby to study.
Yes.
What is it about the part of the world that you enjoy so much?
Oh, I just love it. I love it. I just feel Derbyshire's very varied. There's the High Peak, which is quite raw and quite bleak. And then Derbyshire's also got a softness, and there's lots of low-lying valleys and streams, and the towns in Derbyshire are really nice places.
But you never felt that, because I'm interested, Laura, you never felt the desire or the urge when you were studying, for instance, which is a moment, an opportunity that people often take to go somewhere else in the country. You didn't feel that need?
I have had phases where I've felt embarrassed that perhaps I'm not very well travelled, actually, but there's also something wonderful about living where you live. And I think that I wouldn't be doing what I do, actually, if I didn't feel really settled somewhere. And it isn't that I don't want to travel, because I do, and I love travelling for my work, but having somewhere that I feel really grounded and I feel really rooted in Derbyshire, and that's important to me. The hills nearby are in the pages of text by various different writers, but in particular there's a writer who I love called Alison Uttley, and the way that she wrote about the area and the natural world here really rings true with me, and I literally sort of look out on those hills.
So one of the things we like to do in this podcast, Laura, is to give people listeners a sense of how and where you work. Could you paint a picture of your studio setup here, I wonder?
I'd wondered if you might be a bit surprised how small my studio is.
It isn't large.
It's tiny.
It's true.
Someone recently described it as like a little birdhouse. It's just what I've got available at the moment, actually, but I really like it. I've got a tiny little two-storey office. You can barely stand up in the upstairs part of it, but it's really dinky, and it's a very cosy little space where I do my design work. I've also got a very rough and ready garage space that I make work in, which serves purposes beautifully actually at the moment. And I also make a lot of work. If I am making work in a studio environment, I also do a lot of my work outside, and then obviously undercover when necessary. I sometimes have scaffold systems set up to create particular pieces of work so that levels and covering is right for the work at the time. But in the main, of course, most of my work's built on site. So it's me that travels to the site, and all the material follows on. So that's my working life, really. And
can we talk get into your background a little bit? You grew up on a fruit farm, I think I'm right in saying?
Yes, my dad is an architect, and my mum had a fruit farm. They've retired from the fruit farm now. But it was something that my mum and dad set up together in the 70s, which was the sort of the good life time. And they wanted a project, and it was my mum's business. And I think there is probably something in that, because my mum would work in the fields outside all day, and I really I sort of admired the way that she worked on her own. And she would cut out all the cane every year, tie in, I think there were 2 miles of raspberries, because we once had to measure the wire that the raspberries are tied to, and there's 2 miles of raspberries. And she would cut out these lengths of raspberry cane every year, which are about 6 foot long, coincidentally the length of willow. Not that raspberry sticks are pliable, they're not really. But I used to make lots of dens in those huge piles, you see. There'd be masses of all this cut material. And then there's probably something about the dexterity of picking raspberries, because although it was a pick-your-own fruit farm, I inevitably had to go and pick loads of fruit quite often at weekends for a few orders, I'd sometimes have to pick 25 pounds of fruit on my Saturday, and to reach into the raspberry canes and try and pick as many as possible without crushing them in one go. You put your hand into all the sticks and you tease out all the raspberries really carefully, and then you hopefully place a full hand of raspberries into the basket. I think possibly, and I hope I'm not trying to draw too many parallels to it, but I think possibly there was something in that, which sort of
the movement,
being really dexterous at that young age. But of course, with it being a fruit farm, we had lots of old hedging, which was completely outgrown because it used to be a nursery land. It was a very small part of a plant nursery. A Victorian plant nursery, actually. So a lot of the beech hedges, which had been grown for shelter, had shot up. So we had all these trees around, which meant that I'd got lots of places to play in at the weekends. And I was always on my own, playing on my own in the weekends. And I used to build, I have mentioned this before, but I used to build tree houses, and it was the most creative time of my life.
I've heard you describe it as a creative frenzy.
Yeah. I think I called it a creative fire, which was this big. It was wonderful. It was great.
Can we talk about the treehouse, because it sounded like quite a piece of work. I mean, from the age of 11, I think I remember reading, to 18, you were making this treehouse. Yeah. And what kind of features? Running water?
Not quite. I think looking back, it was. At one point, I wanted a fireplace in it, Grant. I never did it, but I remember investigating whether I could bash thin sheet metal into the right shape so I could have a fireplace. Thank goodness that didn't happen, because who knows what would happen. But I think I had a point where I'd paper mache'd the interior so that it was beautifully soft. It was gorgeous. It was a mess. Structurally, it was just built with whatever was available, and it was a typical treehouse in the sense that it was ramshackle and brilliant, and brilliant because of its ramshackle nature. It had, and I used to chop and change it, you see, because I used to get bored. But it was built in the line of an old hedge of big trees, actually. But it was originally an old hedge, and there was mountain ash and beech, and at one point, built between the splaying trunks of the mountain ash, it was two-storey at one point, and on top of the story there was a little balcony at the top.
Wow!
It was
so
great.
Two-storey, you had stairs?
I had a ladder. I think I got into the second story by going outside of the treehouse and sort of going back in again, and then I had a very small bridge which connected that second story to the other end of the treehouse, because the treehouse ended up being 15 feet long from end to end inside. It was brilliant. I absolutely loved it. I can't tell you. It was. I used to get tools for Christmas, and my cats used to come and sit with me in the treehouse, and it was great.
So were your parents supportive? If you're getting tools for Christmas, presumably they were supportive of this.
Yeah, originally they didn't know about it because I was using wood which had been brought to us because my granddad, who was a joiner, had retired and thought it'd be really useful on our boiler. So it was meant to be for the boiler. I wasn't meant to be using it at all, but it was such a, it was so great to use. I started using little bits of it, and I'll never know at what point my parents realised and maybe pretended that they didn't know, or at what point they just reconciled themselves to letting me do it. But they were eventually really supportive. And that's possibly quite a hard thing to do, actually, for a parent, to let your child just do something relatively dangerous, really. But nevertheless, that's what kept me busy. I remember my mum wringing her hands one day saying, look, you need to come inside. It's raining. This is, but, I couldn't be stopped.
So presumably your father, being an architect, must have thought that you were going to follow in his footsteps.
Yeah, he may have done. He always used to encourage me to draw. In fact, he was the first person who, being my dad, of course, he encouraged me to draw first of all. And he would always say that the lines of my drawings, probably from about the age of 3 onwards, they're good lines, Laura. These are strong lines. And actually that set me off as much as anything on a particular way of working.
I remember reading, or when we spoke in the past, that you'd done these tree houses and then you went off to do kind of an arts course at Derby.
Yes.
It always seems to me like you had quite a difficult time there.
I really enjoyed my degree. I did a variety of different processes throughout the 3 years, but the thing in my head at the time was that nothing felt as creatively frenzied, in a good way, as when I was building tree houses. Because when I've had to, I needed something that I would be utterly addicted to. And until that happened, I knew I hadn't found it. And so I did all my work, and actually I was very interested in the architecture module that we did. I remember getting really good marks for that. I was very interested in the drawing side of it. But it wasn't until right at the end of the degree that I almost sort of confessed this actually to the tutor at the time, and he just said, "Oh, okay, we need to work big." So I was allowed to drag trees in to this space.
Right. So is that what you were doing? You were using bits of old wood to create tree houses, or what were you doing with them?
All I was trying to do was weave things around myself. And I'll never really know why that suddenly became an obvious route, because it did. I'd gone from trying to invent new materials, which I think involved rice at one point, trying to compress rice with things so I could make a new material. I'd gone from and ceramics, and then suddenly to thinking this doesn't quite fit. And there was something about trying to knot things together and weave around myself, which meant something, and tuned into something that I knew I would thrive in, actually. And it was really late. I mean, it was really cutting it fine. But then that's what I did. And I don't know whether that was luck or whether that was always meant to happen, because looking back, from childhood, there was something in that. But I will always be grateful to them for that.
So when did you start using the willow cane?
At university, because it was the only way I could get a lot of sticks in one go.
Right.
That's the only reason.
So it's purely practical?
Yeah. I started trying to bring in hedgerow material from home, but there's a limit to how much you can get, actually. You'd think that, you could probably get quite a lot, but you can only get so much in a car. And this thrill when these willow bundles arrived and I snipped open the string and hundreds of sticks just splayed in every direction. And then I learnt that you soak it and then you can twist it. And from that moment on, I just learned my own process, which is the way it's always been. The method I use was self-taught.
And does that
entirely?
Because we've done public talks and things where people have asked you, do you ever want to make a basket, or have you ever made baskets? And your response has always been quite defensive a little bit.
I am a bit defensive. Yeah, I'll tell you why. It's because I used to feel really embarrassed that I had maybe I ought to have learnt that skill first. Maybe I should. Maybe that says something about my character, but I didn't. I was too impatient. And possibly I wouldn't be doing what I do now if I wouldn't be doing it if I had sort of if I'd gauged myself with how well I could make a basket at that early. I don't know whether it would have led me in the right direction. I really want to stress, however, that I love basketry. It isn't, I'm not repelled by basketry whatsoever. I'm really not. It just isn't my skill. There is something in the way that I work which is about a level of chaos, actually, which really comes together. And that's not a risk. There's no jeopardy involved at all, because I know exactly what I'm doing with my hands and I can see a shape really clearly. But a basket, for example, is made in a very highly skilled way. You start at the bottom and you work up. And my work is drawn out in a sort of quite a frenzied way with lines of willow all over the place. which I know exactly what I'm doing with, but I was always really self-conscious that if people saw that, they would think less of the work somehow, because it doesn't have that beautiful order that a basket has. But then, of course, that all comes together, and then the weave develops a sort of crust, really, of a very smooth weave eventually. And that's when the work starts to become finished, and then the order comes in anyway.
Because there has been, Laura, it seems to me, some ambivalence about your relationship with willow. You have used other materials, but I've also seen you say that you're more interested in the sight and the spectacle rather than necessarily the material. Is that fair?
Oh, that's completely fair, yeah. And sometimes, I wonder whether that's the correct response. I used to, I sometimes don't like being... I prefer to be called... I mean, you can call me what you like, really, but if roughly are referred to as artist, sculptor or whatever, I tend not to prefer the title willow sculptor, because it puts the willow first, and because what I'm doing is something... I'm trying to achieve something that's in my head. I'm not trying to achieve something because I want to find ways of using this particular material. So it's not that I love willow and want to find ways to use it. It isn't that at all. It's the willow is second. The willow comes second. So to put the willow first in the title sort of goes against that a little bit. Not that I'm really that bothered, but...
I promise not to call you a willow sculptor. I promise. I mean, can we talk about... But presumably the willow must have characteristics that inform your work.
Yes, it does. It does.
Well, and what are they?
Well, willow, for example, isn't straight. If you see it growing in the fields, it's easy to think it does grow in relatively straight lines, but it isn't straight. It does have a very gentle curve. And it will not so easily. Once it's been soaked, it's made of long fibres, and when you twist them in the right way, then they give way and they allow you to tie a knot. So there are a lot of lines for me, and there's something about the density that I want. Accumulation is a key word in the creation of my work. So there's a lot of repetition, which I really enjoy. I mean, I will have woven thousands upon thousands upon thousands of sticks in my time, and I really enjoy that. The smoothness of willow appeals. I think it's the length as well, because the willow I use is 1 year old, which means that it's vaguely 6 foot. I mean, give or take a few feet. You can order it at several lengths, but it's roughly 6 foot, the length I work with. So that's a kind of human size. And I work with the willow in pairs as well. I've always worked with it in pairs. I think there's something more, for me, it's probably that I can get double the quantity than weaving one strand. But it visually does something. It's the line in between the pair which maybe does something to the balance of the
spaces
weave.
in between the pair.
That's what I mean,
yeah.
Yes.
Which is quite architectural again. Architects are always talking about the spaces in between, aren't they?
Right. Yes. So there's all sorts of qualities that I do love about willow, and obviously I have been using it for nearly 20 years and I still want to use it, so I do love it. But there's something... I'm not trying to express the material, I'm trying to express something about the hands, I think, because the way that I use the willow is very immediate, because I don't, apart from soaking it in a water tank, I don't really use any other tools. It doesn't have to have a high processing level, or I can use it in a very immediate way, and that's what appeals to me, you see. It's a bit like picking up a pencil and just drawing and, go, go, go. So it's the ease of which I can use it that appeals, and it really works for me. So I'm trying to express something about the way that, to go back to the kind of woven space designs that I've done before, there is a sort of human experience of being within a massive natural material. and knowing that that's been tied and woven by hand, hopefully sort of has a protective quality to it, or it makes you feel being surrounded by something that's been made is part of the appeal that I am going for. And to see something that's been woven by hand and by hand alone is something that I can do with willow, you see. So
it was quite interesting when you left Derby, or you left university. Did you immediately find work? I mean, there's nobody, as far as I'm aware, doing what you do, which is, I guess, a blessing on one hand, but a curse on another. How did you find work when you left?
I used to write off to all sorts of places. I used to sit up in my little bedsit writing letters to all sorts of sculpture parks and galleries, and I'd say probably 1 in 4 came back as positive, and I loved trying to sort of net in, catch some projects for places that I wondered if the work would sit well within. And I think I've always been quite lucky, although this hasn't reflected in my bank balance, but I've always been lucky in that I've probably been fortunate that I can make the type of work that I've always wanted to make. I haven't ever compromised on the look of a piece of work just because it's a commission. And I say that's not always done me any favours financially, but that's something that, nearly 20 years on, I feel quite lucky that it's definitely my every piece has always been.
What was the first commission, Laura?
My first commission was for a wonderful textile artist who I know. She's called Sarah Burgess, and she asked me to make a piece of work in her garden. 2001. So that was the first piece that I made. And I think a couple of years after that, one of the first key exhibitions that I was in was called Out There, which was a Crafts Council exhibition in what was the Crafts Council Gallery at Islington. And that was great because I was able to work on site in a gallery space. And also Mary Butcher, who is a basket maker and artist, she had some work there. Mary Butcher continues to be somebody that does fascinate me. Her work is just looks absolutely effortless and really catches the light of the light coming down through willow. And it won't be effortless whatsoever, but it absolutely looks as if it is. There were interesting people within that exhibition. And then a couple of years later, I was lucky enough to get what was then called the Crafts Council Development Award, which is now called Hot House. And then obviously that led me to other things as well. You
quite often end up working in public places.
Yeah.
Which means you have to deal, I guess, with people when you're working, because you're often outdoors.
Yeah.
I mean, does that bring something to the process?
Yes, but probably just nerves. I don't know. People are always interested in the willow, which is great, and I'm always happy to tell them, because people are amazed if you show them how bendy a willow stick is. They think, oh wow, if they've never seen that before. It is interesting that something which will normally, which you couldn't break, you couldn't fold in half easily when it's dry, is just like a piece of rubber when it's soaked, in a way. And so there's a lot of chatting about the material, but I suppose for somebody like me who is, I'm quite frightened of failure, actually, and I sort of feel the fear and do it anyway with the majority of my work, because it's big and you mentioned the Holborn Museum. Not that anybody actually cares. I don't sort of fool myself that anyone cares, actually. That's the other side of it. But when you're working on the facade of a building, a much prized historic building where the tour buses come past every hour or whatever, you can feel a little self-conscious.
Can we talk about that? But
yeah.
That project, because it's called Murmuration.
Yes.
And it kind of weaved in and out of the building. Was there a brief for that? How did you come up with that particular shape?
Can't remember the brief. I don't remember the brief being anything more specific than it basically involving the museum and the museum's building. I can't remember any specifics that led to the murmuration theme, but I think feeling the scale of that building, which has this columned facade which looks down this beautiful Georgian street, I was trying to feel, you feel like you're quite high up on this balcony, which is where the work was. And I think I was just trying to sort of feel that sense of movement and get a sense of something swarming down through the city. If you see a murmuration over a built-up area, it's fantastic. I last saw one when I was just outside a supermarket, and I sort of stood there in the doorway thinking everyone was just walking in and out as if it wasn't there, and it was enormous. I thought, God, can't you see this? Why are you not stopping and having a look at this amazing thing? Anyway, I think that the interest in starling murmurations was something that was just in my mind at the time, but it is something that I'd like to continue to work on. Although I do know in the same breath that when you're an artist and you're trying to capture a natural phenomenon like that, you're almost on a losing streak straight away. I made a piece of work for Collect, which was exhibited this year in 2019, and it was called And Then They Were Gone, because it followed on from murmuration, although much smaller. But as soon as, I have to face the fact that as soon as you pick up a willow stick, the starlings are gone, because it's static for a start, and it's never actually going to capture the true movement of something like that. But regardless, you can look at a material in a new way, and I think there's something interesting about trying to communicate any kind of language through a material. It leads you into new areas.
This fear that you talk about and failure, I mean, what would failure look like in your mind?
Failure to me would be if I looked at a piece of work after I'd made it and I didn't feel like it did the big boom that I was after. Because I think if I picture the feeling of being inspired, for example, to me it feels like, when they blast a quarry and there's this huge dull boom, and then the ground rises and then all this material is released. That's how it feels in my chest, actually, when something is truly inspiring. You think, wow, gosh, it's so invigorating when you feel inspired. And I'm not suggesting that makers should speak about it, but I find it really interesting, and I'm really grateful when people speak about the process of making, because for something to look effortless, or for something to look at ease with itself, or maybe it's not that, maybe for something to just work, it has so many ups and downs on the way. I mean, there are moments when if you can't get something right, it feels like standing in an icy bucket of water for days. It's horrible. That when it's like, it won't work, it's not quite working, but why? So talking to people while I'm making a piece of work, and they're just quite chipper and interested. But actually I'm standing there thinking, no, but I'm trying to communicate to you that this is what it is, and blah, blah, blah. But actually I'm standing there thinking, but at the moment, this is sheer hell. It can be. And I find it interesting. We see a lot of images of artist studios and everything's calm and beautiful and very, very picturesque, or just very interesting and textural, but what's going on in the mind, and it is really hard. It's really a hard process sometimes. So I'm always on alert that something's really got to work, and there'll be an amount of adrenaline actually to make that happen. And I think that probably should be like that. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't produce the right work. I do like a challenge, but I live in fear, Grant.
Is that fear kind of compounded when you're collaborating. So I'm thinking about the piece you did with Sebastian Cox that we talked about
yeah.
in the introduction, the Invisible Store of Happiness.
Yep.
I mean, if you're talking about the kind of emotional roller coaster that you're going on when you create a piece, if you're working with somebody else and you have to be aware of their feelings, does that make it harder, I wonder? Oh
yeah, I'm sure it does. Working with Sebastian was fantastic, I must say. We always said that we would definitely work together again, and we did, because we then worked together for a project in Milan. But yeah, it is hard. I suppose it's difficult to. You just want to make it the best for everyone, and so. Yeah, but it's interesting, isn't it? Collaborating is a really interesting, is an amazing journey to go on, and gosh, it teaches you a lot.
Well, I was going to ask what you learned from it.
Well, I'm immensely self-critical, you see, so I spent a lot of time when I was with Sebastian. Obviously, we were using a lot of machinery which I don't know how to use. Not that was a problem though, because he's wonderfully accommodating and brilliant to work with, and his team are wonderful. So I just felt really at home, actually. But I think what you're referring to is that I think I remember telling you that when we were trying to get that design together, I think I felt really overwhelmed by it at one point, and I couldn't. To try to sort of design something where two people's minds come together in the right way is hard, but thankfully that turned out to be a great project. It was me that asked Sebastian in the first place if he'd be interested in collaborating, so I was really thrilled that he was, and I continue to be really inspired by him, because I'm really inspired by anybody who is driven and committed to their work and committed to their ethos. And I mean, Sebastian has a very environmental ethos, and he really is committed to that. And actually, that made me think a little bit about my ethos with Willow, because I've talked about it as if it's this secondary thing, and actually, in the last few years, I've come to realise how terrific it is that I'm working with an environmentally responsible material. That's brilliant. I was working with Sebastian that sort of shook me into that, to be honest.
Does it bother you? Does it matter that your work isn't permanent, that it does? I mean, it changes over time, obviously, but it does ultimately rot.
Yes, it's not forever. They can last for years. And obviously, if a brief requires longevity, then I use another material. But sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. If a piece of work is made for an exhibition, which is definitely going to be temporary anyway, it doesn't bother me at all. And the work lives on in photography. And I would rather do something that I really want to do in a space and know that sadly it will have to be cut into unsalvageable sections just to get back out through the door. I would rather do that than make something that's compromised and make something that just fits through the door. So it sometimes it does make me sad, but sometimes it's just the way that I work. I don't like sort of compromising on things. So then yeah.
And you've been experimenting with other materials. I mean, kind of throughout your career. I seem to remember Blomberg. You worked with computer cables.
Yes.
Right. But more recently, thatch.
Yeah, I'm really interested in thatch. I haven't done much work with thatch, but I got a little Arts Council grant a couple of years ago to just spend time with a thatcher and make something in which I would learn the skill. Well, I say that, blimey. In which I would begin to learn the skill. I mean, obviously, to be a thatcher, you might need to train for years and years and years. But I'm really interested in, it goes back to accumulation, you see. And I'm trying to design some pieces at the moment, actually, that use thatch and to express the volume of material in an area where the willow is grown. And because if you ever go into a warehouse where they're storing willow, it's amazing. You know, the piles and the stacks of willow, the volume of willow that's in there is unbelievable, and all the ends face you. And I love that texture of thatch, that all the ends, and they're incredibly firm, of course, because they're all battered up into the structure, and it's firm and solid. And there are limits to what I can do with thatch because of the structure that is required to support the weight of it. But I think this is quite a slow burning project for me, and I think it could be something that I would like to work with in the future. I mean, I also have a project on the go at the moment, which is also similarly slow burning, but hopefully will come to fruition soon, and that's in stone. Using a dry stone wall method and working with a small team of dry stone wallers to make forms that make a form that comes out of a sloping landscape, a bit like sap coming out of the wood, sort of seeping out of the land. So there are other things that are ahead, but they involve working with other skilled craftsmen.
So your work is about agglomeration or accumulation of material, but also these techniques that you're talking about, they're kind of heritage techniques. I mean, some of them could be on the Heritage Craft Association's red list, for instance.
Yeah.
Is it a conscious decision to try and bring them into a kind of more contemporary sphere?
No, it's about coordination of hand and eye. So with dry stone walling, for example, the material is at your feet and you handle each stone, and with the coordination of hand and eye, you find where that stone goes. Very few tools. I mean, there are some tools in dry stone walling, of course, but they're nominal hand tools. It's relatively immediate, and it generally uses just that one material. So, no, I suppose what you've just said is a good thing. That would be good. That would be a bonus, wouldn't it? But no, it's not a conscious decision.
And will the willow continue to run through your work?
Yeah, I hope it will. Yeah, I hope it will. We'll see. I've never been anybody who's had a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan. I just hope that in the future I am still doing things that give me joy, because there's so much joy in actually making work. I mean, I've described the difficulties, but it's a very, very joyful process as well. Some of the happiest moments of my life have been making my work, truly, and meeting wonderful people. And so, yeah, I hope it will continue. I hope that the willow will be there. Whenever, for example, I go and occasionally visit the farm where the willow comes from, it's like visiting distant family. Honestly, I've known them for so long now, and they really are sort of embedded in my work somehow. So,
Well, Laura, that's a lovely place to finish. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
To learn more about Laura's work, go to lauraellenbacon.com. There are images of the interviews as well as little films and other things on my Instagram page, Grant on Design. If you've enjoyed listening and want to see this podcast flourish, then please rate and review on Apple Podcasts and go to my Patreon page and make a pledge. You can find that at patreon.com/Material Matters. You'll be helping to take the message of the importance of materials, skill, craft and design to a whole new audience. And finally, if you want to sponsor an episode or indeed an entire series, do drop me a line on gdgibson@btinternet.com. Thanks very much for listening.